What should we do with the ending of St. Mark's Gospel? That's the topic of this episode of ATP, Ask the Pastor. So anyone who's read their Bible and who's read the ending of Mark is confronted with those dreadful brackets that encompass verses 9 through 20 in Mark chapter 16. And whether it's an asterisk or a bracket or they put those verses in the footnote, it always says something along the lines of the oldest manuscripts lack verses 9 through 20. And what this does is it signals to the reader that these verses aren't authentic and they shouldn't be read as if they were divinely inspired. And it may also, perhaps inadvertently, teach that Scripture, as we've received it in the past, is unreliable. What we find, though, however, if we dig into the evidence, is that the opinion that those verses are inauthentic isn't as cut and dried as modern translations make it seem. There's actually 4 endings to Mark's Gospel. The first possibility is that Mark simply ended his Gospel with verse 8. Verse 8 reads, "So they went out quickly and fled from the tomb, for they trembled and were amazed. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid." Some ending, right? The second possibility is a short ending that's found in several manuscripts. It reads, "But they reported to Peter and those things which he had told them. And after this, Jesus himself sent out through them from the east to the west the sacred and imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation." The third possibility is that verses 9 through 20 are authentic, while the fourth possibility is that Mark concludes after verse 14 with a lengthy conversation between Christ and the disciples. The topic of that conversation was the end of Satan's reign and apocalyptic things to come. Now, of those 4 possibilities, the second and the fourth can be easily discarded immediately. Possibility number 2, the short conclusion, is only found in 4 Greek manuscripts from the 7th to 9th century, Old Latin K, and some translations, and so it's very late in the transmission history. Possibility number 4, the alternate conclusion, is found in only one manuscript, Codex Washingtonianus, which is preserved by Jerome in the 4th century. That leaves us with option 1, that Mark abruptly ends after verse 8, or option 3, that Mark chapter 16 verses 9 through 20 are Markan. They are authored by Mark and authentic. Now, when English translations say or note that the oldest manuscripts don't contain verses 9 through 20, it means that 2 codices from the 4th century, named Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, don't have these verses. These 2 codices, a codice is a booklet, enjoy what I call a highly favored status among textual critics, even though both of these codices disagree with each other quite often. Vaticanus has several readings that aren't supported by other manuscripts, while some of its other readings are only supported by papyrus fragments or translations into other languages. Sinaiticus also then adds the Epistle of Barnabas and portions of the Shepherd of Hermas to its New Testament. So while these 2 manuscripts may very well be the oldest manuscripts that we possess, that doesn't guarantee their accuracy. Something odd, too, that needs to be said about Vaticanus' ending of Mark. Vaticanus omits Mark's ending, and most take that as evidence against the authenticity of those verses. But there's something funny about this, because when Vaticanus ends, when one book of the Bible ends in that manuscript, the next one begins immediately, except at the ending of Mark. Mark's gospel ends, but Luke's gospel doesn't follow immediately. In fact, there's an entire column left empty after Mark 16, verse 8. This means that the scribe or scribes responsible for Vaticanus knew of the long ending of Mark and didn't wholly discredit it, but left enough space should they or someone else decide to include it at a later date. This really isn't new information, though, because we have early patristic witnesses to the long ending of Mark that go all the way back to the middle of the 2nd century. Justin Martyr, he died around 165 AD. He references these verses in the first book of his Apology. Tatian, who was a student of Justin Martyr, includes verses 9 through 20 in his Diatessaron. The Diatessaron was the very first harmony of the 4 Gospels. Irenaeus of Lyon, who lived in the mid to late 2nd century, 200 years before Vaticanus was copied, quotes Mark 16:19 in book 3 of his work Against Heresies, and in book 2 he quotes verses 17 and 18. So even though the oldest manuscripts we possess don't have the long ending of Mark, church fathers in Rome and Gaul had them around 150 to 160 AD, if not sooner, if not earlier, excuse me. Now, other church fathers in the East, such as Clement of Alexandria, didn't mention these verses, though Origen and Eusebius of Caesarea admit that they knew of them, but they didn't think that they were authentic. The long ending of Mark, it's found in many uncial capital letter codices, the earliest being from the 5th century. It's also found in 95% of the known manuscripts that we have. The problem with these manuscripts, at least in the eyes of the textual critics, is that they represent what is called the Byzantine text type. The Byzantine text type is generally a smoother Greek than other text types. And since the discovery of Codex Sinaiticus in 1844, the Byzantine text type has really been disparaged, along with the English translations that stem from it, like the KJV and the New King James. Now, that being one thing, the textual evidence, critical scholars also claim that internal evidence is against the authenticity of these verses. So internal evidence consists of things like vocabulary and syntax. It's argued that several of the words that are used in verses 9 through 20 aren't words that Mark used earlier in his gospel. It's also stated that the connection between verses 8 and 9 is awkward and clunky, and there's no reason to identify Mary Magdalene again in verse 9 because she'd already been introduced. R.C.H. Lenski, who was a 20th century Lutheran exegete and one who believed in the authenticity of Mark's ending, correctly notes, though, that the issue shouldn't be whether or not an author has used certain words already, but rather do those words fit what the author wants to say. Lenski also goes on to point out that these verses don't add any new doctrines or new episodes to the post-resurrection sequence, but match up quite well with the other gospel accounts, and not necessarily in a way that shows that Mark is dependent upon others. Now, some contemporary scholars note the connection also between the Son of God theme at the beginning of Mark's Gospel and the ascension and enthronement in the long ending. Others see parallels between the disciples' original commissioning in Mark 3, verses 14 to 15, and their final commissioning in the long ending. The point of all this is to say that based on external evidence and internal evidence, that is, manuscript evidence and textual evidence, the long ending of Mark shouldn't be disparaged or easily dismissed. Now, one thing that the text critic then, who rejects the authenticity of the long ending, has to deal with is why did Mark abruptly stop after verse 8? And the theory that's most popular right now is that Mark ended his gospel with this verse 8 on purpose in order to shock his readers, which I personally think is a bunch of hooey. Other suggestions are that Mark ended his gospel at verse 8 accidentally, that perhaps death prevented him, or that the final leaf of the gospel fell out on the way to be copied. Something interesting about those verses is that Mark's verse 8 ends with the Greek word gar, which is translated for, F-O-R. And that's never, ever in Greek literature the ending of a book. So that gives credence to the idea that Mark's ending was original, but that it went missing at some point in the transmission process, which would explain why some manuscripts have it, but other manuscripts lack those verses. So another question that remains is, why do modern translations include Mark's ending, either in the text or in a footnote, if they don't believe it's authentic to begin with? Well, the answer is because they readily admit that those verses are ancient, just not ancient enough for their liking. So Bruce Metzger admitted in his work, The Textual Commentary on the New Testament, that the eclectic text allows those verses to remain in the text simply, quote, out of deference for those verses' evident antiquity, end quote. So for critical scholars, these verses are ancient, just not ancient enough to have been from the pen of St. Mark, because they prefer two codices of the New Testament over all others. My opinion is, quite frankly, that there's enough manuscript evidence to believe that these words are the very words of St. Mark, written under the inspiration of Holy Scripture. I think it's much easier to account for an early loss of these verses in some manuscripts than it is to account for their later addition, especially when one considers that there are church fathers witnessing to these verses as early as the mid-2nd century. Another thing for us Lutherans to consider is that Martin Luther uses Mark 16:16 in his small catechism as a proof text for baptismal regeneration. Now, baptismal regeneration is taught elsewhere in Scripture, so that if this passage weren't authentic, baptismal regeneration would still be taught. But Luther, using the received text that was available to him, selected this verse as his scriptural proof that baptism does save. As Lutherans, I don't think that we should allow modern translations to take this verse from us without a fight, because I think there's really enough manuscript evidence to show that these verses are original to Mark, so that when we do read them, we can read them with confidence and say, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks for the questions. We'll catch you next time on ATP Ask the Pastor.